Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. Today, I am joined by Toby Oliver. Welcome, Toby.
Hi, thank you. It's lovely to see you, Tara.
It's lovely to meet you and to have you on here. Toby is a therapist specializing in bereavement, and he's a yoga teacher, and now he is also an author, which is super exciting. We're going to talk about your book, Rise and Shine, which I have a copy of here. And I was thinking, Toby, it would be really interesting to hear your story in terms of becoming a bereavement therapist.
Sure, yes. So I think there are two bits to the story. There's the sort of how it happened, and then how I look back and realize how it perhaps really happened. So I began my career working in the arts, marketing, cultural communications. And I was loved storytelling and changing people's lives, or seeing people have their lives changed through sort of theatre performance, stories being told. And then I felt the need for new challenges. I retrained as a yoga teacher. And as part of that, teaching yoga and meditation, I found myself teaching at a local hospice, working with people who were managing a life-limiting condition or had a family member, and also people who'd been bereaved through serious life-limiting illness. And in those workshops, which I found really, really rewarding, so I was doing a weekly, it was called various things, meditation workshop, but it was, as we know with meditation, it's where all our stuff starts to come up. And I could see myself recognizing how I could help and really wanting to help individuals, and thinking, if only I could work with you individually, I really think I know what would help you, but realizing I had to manage the needs of the whole group. And that's when I realized I wanted to then train again and retrain as a therapist, specializing in bereavement and in people with a serious or life-limiting condition. And which is what I did. And I think it's interesting because a lot of people train in therapy and then move into group work, and it was sort of the other way around. But then I realized, people would ask me about it, and I realized that I've always been, I don't quite know how to say this without sounding odd, I was always fascinated by death as a child. I would talk about death a lot and ask about death, and get very upset about trying to make sense of people dying. So worrying about my pets dying, worrying about my parents, my grandparents. And I know, as a young child, my mum was really good at being honest, having honest conversations about it. But I look back now and realize my mum lost her dad. Her dad died when she was 11, and he had a serious illness for a long time. And so I imagine that those conversations must have been really hard for her, and how amazing that she was then able to have that conversation. My grandmother talked about death a lot, her mum, because a lot of her family, close and extended family, had been murdered in the Holocaust, and she was very open, talked about that. And so I think I grew up in a culture of death. I don't know, that sounds strange, but that death was talked about and recognized. And that seemed normal because, our childhoods seem normal, don't they? And then when I was 13, my dad's mum was diagnosed with cancer, with lung cancer, and she didn't want treatment. She moved in with us while she was dying. So she lived with us for 6 months, and that was such an amazing, privilege to have that time with her. And she ended up moving into a hospice for the last few days, which is where she actually died, because she was very clear she didn't want to die at home, because her bedroom was our dining room, and she said, I don't want that memory, I don't want to spoil it, I don't want the children, my grandchildren, to come in and find me, because I don't want them to have that upset, which is, again, a really, really lovely gift for her. So I think looking back, part of it is I had these experiences, and then into sort of my early 20s, friends had premature children, and who later died at a few weeks old. Another friend's mum was, one of my best friend's mum was murdered by her partner, who we'd known for a long time. So I think there was a lot of dealing with death, but no actual support other than just support from within families and friendship and social groups, no sort of formal support, and no one recommended or even suggested it. And I think I look back and realize how those incidents, those bereavements affected me, and how I would have benefited from that support, that help. And then later, I know this is becoming a really long story.
That's great.
But later, when I was working, so when I was in my working life and I worked in local government managing cultural projects and arts events, a colleague who I'd worked with for 12 years died very suddenly, in suspicious circumstances, shall we say. So ostensibly she died falling down the stairs, but she was in an abusive relationship. So it was inconclusive, but I have my own sort of thoughts about what probably happened. And the organization I worked for was so unbelievably terrible and insensitive at dealing with that death and the impact of that death on the team, and that really angered me. And I think that was part of why I then had a career change, because I think I got that life is too short, and I don't want to work for organizations that don't care about someone who'd worked, I think she'd worked there for 25, 30 years. And so I think for me, it was these incidents that made me reassess my life, but also think we can do this better as a society, as a culture, and we need to do it better. And I think, if nothing else, the last few years have told us again, even more loudly, we can do this better and we need to do it better. So I feel really, I guess, proud and validated in the choice to come and work in this arena, because I think it's needed more now more than ever.
Yes, absolutely. And it really does feel like you were being prepped almost through your childhood. And I was actually thinking today, because we've got more a lot of news when we're filming this on the 16th of December about Omicron, and I'm always amazed. I love the fact that your family had this really open dialogue about death and what we think about it, or how we're going to prepare for it, or where we want to die. These questions, I'm always amazed that more people are not thinking about or talking about, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. So I'm always curious, to have these conversations more about what we want for ourselves and how we should be telling family and preparing ourselves, because we never know. We never know, do we?
No, absolutely. And often people don't think about it because they don't want to upset, parents don't want to upset kids don't want to upset parents. And then what happens is it gets left either till the very last minute when we're at sort of crisis point, and no one is able to sort of think in any way sort of without being overwhelmed by the emotion and the immediacy of dealing with the situation, or it's too late because, as you say, we never know when things are going to happen. We hope that people are going to live what we would think of as a sort of a long and natural life, but we know that that's not always the case and not often the case.
That's because in your work you're dealing with a lot of cancer patients, and also the families of those patients.
So cancer patients, and also people with motor neurone disease as well, and their families. So it's individuals who have an incurable condition, and some of that is long-term and manageable, and then it's a lot of family members who've been bereaved through cancer. So everything from people, parents who've had children die, spouses, siblings, parents, and a lot of the times the regret and the sadness come from not having had the conversations, or feeling able to have had the conversations. And so the terrible sort of self-torture of, did I do the right thing?
Yeah.
Or even if they have had the conversations where, people may have agreed, someone may have expressed a wish, I want to die at home. And then towards the end, actually the pain, or maybe the symptoms of the illness become so strong and so serious that they can't be effectively managed at home. So decisions are then remade. And often people then find that really difficult, because perhaps their loved one has gone into hospital or a hospice to have, the pain managed. And then unfortunately they die there. So they haven't been able to die at home. But, perhaps they actually died not in pain, or, it was maybe ended up being a better death than they perhaps would have had at home. But it's very difficult for people not to feel the guilt and to get caught up. So a lot of the work is trying to help people, tell other stories about it, and to sort of to acknowledge that they were doing the best that they could, and the best for their loved ones, with the knowledge and the experience they had. And none of us get prepared. We don't get prepared for this, and we don't get taught it as well. We don't get taught it in school. And often if someone is bereaved at school, it's not talked about, because it's that we don't want to upset them, and people are kept out of school. And so it's this terrible secret. I was talking to a friend today who, her children are at school, and one of the parents of a fellow child died by suicide. It's a small community. The whole community knows that this person died by suicide, knows how this person died, because it was, in the papers and people talk. But this child doesn't know. So all of the teachers and all the parents have been told not to say anything. And so they're telling their kids. And I think, well, I don't want to judge, but I think, well, that feels to me like that's going to create a situation where that child perhaps doesn't feel able to talk about it. Or if they do talk, maybe their fellow, their friends or their friends' parents are going to avoid talking about it at all. And I think, again, it's a sort of symptom of the fact that we feel so uncomfortable with what is, one of the most natural things. The two things we know are going to happen to us in life is we're born. If we're here, we've been born, and that we're going to die at some point. And yet we get ourselves in such complications about it. And I know that people are doing it for the best of intentions, but I think often we then store up all sorts of difficulties.
Oh my goodness, completely. Yeah. And I was thinking, gosh, we've come such a long way. And then you hear a story like that in the past week.
Yeah.
And you do realize that, there's still a lot of awareness and education that people need around talking about death and communicating to children about it as well. Yeah. But I think unless you've had a personal experience, and I'm not saying it's exclusively like that, because I know a lot of people who also will not shy away from it and talk about it, but it definitely helps, doesn't it, if we've had a personal experience, to feel comfortable talking about death. And like you were saying about birth and death being the things that we are guaranteed, it was making me think a little bit like when there's a birth plan. A lot of people have a birth plan. I mean, and invariably they don't go to plan a lot of the time. So you have to remain flexible in your mind. But it's the same with a death plan. I think everybody should have a death plan as well. And again, know that you may not end up getting it exactly as you want it, but it's something that you've consciously had an intention around.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's a really nice analogy, actually. I think that's really useful. And also the fact that we make decisions all the time about, this is what I'm going to want to do. And we get to that situation and we realize, I don't want that. And so it's that assumption that maybe people will, because none of us know what death is like. We've not done it before. And so therefore we can have the best plan, And then things may change, or we may suddenly think, actually, I don't want that. Just as there are people who plan for a home birth and they go into labor and they think, actually, no, I don't want to have this child at home. I've changed my mind. It doesn't feel how I thought it would feel. And so maybe people feel like that as well. Right. And there are some people who believe, that we make a choice. We make a choice about when we're born, and we make a choice about, to some extent, about when we feel ready to die in that moment. And so, maybe sometimes those people who do go into hospital for, to have their pain managed think, oh, actually, maybe I feel ready. Maybe this feels a safe environment for me to, to let go. And it's very common as well in hospitals that people die when a relative has, stepped out to go to the toilet, or has gone for a break, or has been told, you go home and get some sleep. There's not been any change. You come back in the morning. And I think, for some people, it's a private sort of experience. Or maybe they're like my granny. They perhaps in some level, they're wanting to spare people.
Yeah, it is really remarkable that happened with our mother, because she was at home when she died. And my middle sister, who, to be honest, was probably like the most enmeshed with my mum, and she left for the first time, popped out to go and see a friend. And that's when our mother left. And I often feel it's as if it's harder for them to leave, if we're holding on. It's very, very interesting that. And I was thinking while you were talking about how, when you're working with clients who have terminal illness, do you find that if they have a sort of spiritual connection or belief, that they feel less afraid of dying? Is it a little bit difficult to?
I don't know if people feel less afraid. I think it's interesting because in the UK, we don't tend to talk about religion. We tend to think of religion as a more private thing. And I find it really privileged because often people will have those experiences. And I noticed that when I was doing the groups, because often I take people through a meditation, through a visualization, that wasn't about death, bereavement, but often people would, that's what's at the forefront of people's minds, either their own mortality or perhaps someone that they've recently lost. So often that people would come up with, seeing people. I had one woman who said, I felt really peaceful and I saw my husband, but I saw him as he was when he was well and healthy. And I thought I would never remember that again, because all I can remember is the illness, the pain, and how horrible it was. And she just said, oh, thank you so much for giving me that. And I said, well, I didn't give you anything. You did that. That was that's those memories are there. And, that's a real sign that you're starting to able to, reach back to them. I just created a space. You did the work. And it led into a sort of a discussion about what people thought, would happen at death, after death. And it was really interesting. It was a very mixed group. So there were a couple of, there was a woman who was Hindu, and talked about reincarnation. There was a woman who was Muslim, so talked about, there were a couple of women who were Muslim and talked about sort of the Islamic beliefs. There were, some Christians, some Church of England, and then some people who would say they had spiritual beliefs, others who didn't have a faith. But what was so interesting was that it was a really respectful conversation. And actually people were really interested in that sense of, what do you believe and how does that help you? And you could see people thinking, oh, I can see how that would really help you. And almost as if they were trying it on, for size and thinking, oh yeah, okay, maybe I'll just leave the door open. And I think a lot of people at that point of facing their own mortality either go back to an existing faith or are open to it. And often people come and are a little bit sheepish, reticent, maybe talking about it. And I'm really clear that you know, we can discuss anything and there's no judgment from me. It's, you know, and often people will talk about signs, you know, either before death or after death and what's significant. And some people link that to faith and some don't. And I think, you know, what's so interesting is whatever beliefs we have or don't have, we're going to find out whether we're right or wrong at death. We won't find out before. And actually, in some ways, you know, on one level, I think that's really interesting because we will get the answer. We will get the answer. Each of us will get the answer. We can't come back and tell people, but we'll get the answer. And so I always say to people, you know, some people get quite worried about what they believe or don't believe because they either think maybe it's in conflict with a religion they've been brought up in, the teachings of that religion, or they don't see themselves as religious. And I always think, does it give you solace? Does it help you feel sort of peaceful and more able to cope? And then if it does, what harm is that? You know, it's your belief, you know, it's your mind, your spirit. You can choose to believe or not, whatever feels right for you. Because actually, you know, there's a difference between faith and religion. Religion is the sort of the human bit we've added on, which is all the rules. But actually, you know, most faiths have that sort of the fundamental core, and it's about a belief that we are more than just a body. And so if you feel that in a particular way, and that's helpful and gives you solace and helps you cope with this condition, then, you know, that's great. Let's explore that. And one of my, a dear friend and one of my yoga teachers recently passed away from motor neurone disease. And she found that her sort of her yoga practice, but it was just, you know, very sort of authentic spiritual yoga practice. And that belief of the body is just the vehicle for the soul was the thing that helped her cope and write about how actually it enabled her to deepen her understanding and her connection to the divine, that as her body gradually shut down, she discovered more and more that she was far more than the body. And in her experience, that enabled her to feel that it was such a gift in a very strange way. You know, it's not to say she didn't have terrible sadness and loss, and other people's experience may be different, but she found it really deepened her spirituality and her connection. And it was really humbling to hear. And she couldn't talk, she'd had a voice, and then she'd write. And she'd write these beautiful teachings and sort of wisdoms and insights that had given her. So yeah, that really, really helped her. And I know other clients I've worked with have talked about that and, about going back to church. And is it all right for me to go back? I haven't been for 20 and 30 years. And I said, well, do you want to go? I'm not aware of any church that turns people away. And most churches are really, really happy to increase the numbers of their congregation. So if that feels right for you, go explore it if you think that will help you. If you go once or twice or 3 times and then you think it's not helping, then that's fine. You've not lost anything, but you've learned something. So I think it can do. I think for other people, it can make them very angry and a sense of, that perhaps God has let them down or betrayed them, that I've believed in you, I've tried my best to be a good person, and why are you punishing me that? And the same questions that we all ask when someone we love is going through a terrible time, or we're going through a terrible time. Why is this happening? It's not fair. And I think if you have a faith and you feel that, perhaps then that anger, that questioning is directed at God, that can be really troubling for people. So I think for other people, it can be really difficult. And some people lose their faith, and some people feel it as a test. Like Job, it's a real test of faith. So I don't know if it's as easy to say. I wish it was. I wish I could say it. And I think I think for some people, yes, it provides a great sense of stability, and others, it shakes their identity of themselves and themselves.
Yes, it's really fascinating. But just talking to you now, I was thinking, imagining if I was a client of yours and thinking how reassuring, everything you're sharing, and really just leading people to do what feels right for them. And that's the point, isn't it? That we have to really think what's right for us. And I suppose a lot of religion, like you say, feels more outside of us, that we should do this or we shouldn't do that. Yeah.
And I think a lot of grief work with people is that reassurance, that normalization. You know, so many people are sort of saying, is this normal? That's the one that I say that's probably, if you would say, what's the most common question you get, is it normal that I'm doing this, I'm feeling this? Is it normal that I woke up crying and I just didn't stop crying all day, and then I went to bed and I was still crying as I fell asleep? I've never cried like that. And you think, well, you've never lost your mom, you've never lost your dad before. Yes, it's normal. And I think a lot of it is that it's unlike any situation you've been in before. And so most things are normal. It's only if, you were coming to me and said, I've been crying like that every day for, 365 days, that we might say, maybe there's, something's got stuck. But yeah, a lot of it is reassuring people that they're not going crazy, that there's not something irredeemably wrong with them. And actually really beautifully, I remember, one person saying to me, I feel like a child who's lost their dad. And I said, you are a child who's lost their dad. Maybe that's, that's fine. And I said, maybe what we need to is find a way of reassuring, and consoling that child that you're there, and that actually it's, that it's okay. Because what they would normally do is have their dad to do that. And so it's finding a way. But I think clients come out with the most sort of poetic and profound things sometimes. And then they invariably say, oh, I'm just not being clear, I'm not expressing myself well. And you think, you're expressing yourself so beautifully, so eloquently, remarkably so, because I couldn't have put it as well as that. You've really managed to express exactly what you're going through. And that's really normal. But, probably most of the day you don't feel like, because we live lives within our comfort zones mainly.
So maybe we don't also have the opportunity to express ourselves to many people until you get into a room with a therapist like yourself and have that quiet to talk without somebody talking over you. Yeah.
Yes, maybe, or trying to somehow fix you. Or rush to offer you solutions. I think a lot of that's what people get. Because naturally, as humans, we don't like to see someone upset. So we immediately offer them tissues. Can I get you water? Can I do this? And we interrupt, and we don't allow the space for them to just have the emotion. So people invariably will apologize for crying or for getting upset. And a lot of it is just, this is your space if that's what you need to do. And I have clients who will say, oh, I only ever cry when I come and talk to you. And I say, that's really normal. I don't take it personally. But then some of them don't want to come for that reason, because they say, I'm fine in the rest of my life. I don't cry anywhere else. And they don't like it because they think somehow not crying or not talking about emotions is keeping it together. And you have to, or I have to respect that if that's not what they feel ready for, and I'm not encouraging people to cry, it's just allowing them. But some people really, I think some people, it really takes them out of their comfort zone.
Yes, absolutely. Do you find that you have more female clients than male clients, or it's even, or?
Well, it's really interesting, because I assumed I was going to have predominantly female clients, because I've always sort of had close relationships with women. Most of my close friends were women, and very close relationships with my female relatives. And then I was really surprised. I kept getting male clients. And and then, of course, I didn't, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. Okay, I'm getting lots of male clients. And then my husband said to me, do you not think it's because you're a man and they feel more comfortable talking to a man? And I went, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about it. It seems so obvious. But of course, and I think often there aren't as many male therapists.
Yeah, there's not.
Yeah. There really aren't. And I think that I like to think I'm not sort of threatening or scary. And I'm not saying other male therapists are, but I think, I'm not an alpha male, and it's not sort of competitive. And I think maybe there's a sense of it feels safe, and that they can, maybe talk to me in a way that perhaps they don't feel able or know how to talk to their, wives, girlfriends, or their, male friends or colleagues. Because sadly, there is still this, expectation on men to present and behave in a certain way. And a lot of boys have been brought up, being taken to task for expressing emotion, either by family, or even if not by family, then invariably at school, by sort of other pupils, and often by teachers. And I know that, that happened in my school, the teachers would criticize boys openly in front of the whole class for in any way expressing any sort of affection or friendship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
or perceived weakness, and I think that leaves such a lasting damage for people.
It does. I really hope we are on the precipice of change, and that we see more men doing the work that you do, because it's so valuable.
Yeah,
it's so valuable. Toby, I wanted to talk about your book, because even though it's, when I first read this, how to transform your life morning by morning, in my head I thought it was like the word when we mourn grief.
Yes.
Because we'd met through the grief community. So, but actually it's a book about your morning routine.
It is, yes.
Yeah. So tell us about your book, and how I believe this could be very supportive for people who are grieving. Yeah.
So it's called Rise and Shine. And SHINE is an acronym that stands for the 5 elements that me and my sister, who I've written the book for, and she's a psychologist, so I get it right. She's a psychologist trained at Oxford and really experienced, works in the corporate field. So actually, we've sort of brought together a corporate background, and then a more sort of person-centered, sort of a therapeutic background. And we realized individually that we'd developed morning routines that had really helped us deal with sort of personal and professional issues around mental well-being. And I then started sharing these techniques with clients, and found them really, really transformative. And we wanted to help more people. And we were talking about sort of, I had ideas for books I wanted to write, and then my sister Kate said, "Oh, I've got this really good idea," and talked about it. I said, "Oh, well, I have these morning routines." And then we went, "Why don't we write it together?" Which was interesting, because we'd never worked together. And as kids, we used to fight like Tom and Jerry. So who knew how it was going to turn out? And luckily it turned out well, and we've got a book published. So that was lucky. And so SHINE is the acronym for the 5 elements, which are silence, happiness, intention, nourishment, and exercise. And it's what we really wanted to set out was something that was really, really simple. You had a really simple structure, but there was like creating a menu so that you could blend the right routine for you. It's not one of these books that says you have to do this, you must do this, and it's really rigid. It's about making it as easy, flexible, and enjoyable as possible. And what people, the book came out a month or so ago, and actually that's the feedback we're getting from people, that they really like that fact. And I think, to speak to your question about grief, whilst this isn't specifically for people who are grieving, I find a lot in my work that people who are in grief find mornings especially hard. I think they find evenings hard, and a lot of the rest of the day, but mornings, that sense of waking up to another day without that person, with that grief, and a day, you know, looming ahead of you, and what am I going to do? So I think sometimes having the simplest of routines to give you an anchor and to give you a sense of, well, I've achieved something. And I know from working with, you know, clients in the hospice or through the cancer charity, sometimes for some people, you know, the fact that they got out of bed, they washed and dressed themselves is the biggest achievement, you know, they can manage. And whether they were, you know, CEO of a top company, or they, you know, they raised 7 kids, actually at this point in their lives, that's what's meaningful. And I think sometimes just that sense of having a few things that we can do, and ideally things for ourselves, can help us feel from the start of the day that we've almost taken control in some small way and created a sense of achievement and a sense of sort of safety, calm, whatever we need. The day can. So I think it can really help. I would really like to, and that's in the, you know, back of my mind, is it's a future book that's one that's specifically aimed at for people in grief, because I find a lot of the grief books, they're great, really, really helpful, but they're not always particularly practical. That a lot of the books talk about the sort of the theories, the process of grief, but often people say, what can I do? You know, what can I do?
True, actually.
And it's, you know, and you know, whilst part of it is you need to sort of, you know, grieve fully, as David Kessler always says, which I think is brilliant, grieve fully and live fully, that actually there are some tools and some techniques that can help you. And it's not to say they'll help everyone, but actually sometimes just knowing, oh, I can try this. And just, you know, I know that I work with people, and there is just some simple maybe breathing techniques or self-soothing techniques that people will say, oh yeah, I do that, and I was just feeling so overwhelmed and I did it, and it helped. It made me somehow feel less overwhelmed, that I could get through it, you know, riding out the storm. And I think that's what I'd really like to look at doing.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea. And then you can call it morning to morning.
Yeah, something exactly. Yeah, something like that. If that's not too sort of crass or cheesy.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure you're going to come up with a better.
Oh, I don't know.
Much better. Toby, last question.
Yes.
I like to ask people, what is your interpretation of conscious grief?
Gosh, what's my interpretation of conscious grief? I think that would be allowing yourself to be open to the experience that you're having, so that you can sort of be present with the emotions, to sort of allow them to bring the messages, to bring the changes that they need to make, without sort of maybe rushing to fight against them, to change them straight away. I think it would be that, because I think, you know, the grief, you know, I often talk about the river of grief, and I find that people often talk about that, or just say, I feel like I'm drowning, or I feel like a wave. And so I think conscious grief is finding a way to allow yourself to just, you know, to go with the flow of that river. And I think that's where the techniques, because I think sometimes when I talk about the techniques, it's like finding a life jacket, and you know, and if we can start with a life jacket, maybe we can then find a life raft, and maybe we can then find a sail, and it becomes smoother and smoother. But initially, I think conscious grief is just allowing yourself to flow in the direction the grief wants to take you. And often we either want to try and, you know, stand in the stream and stop it, or we want to swim back. You know, we want to swim back to how things were. So I think conscious grief is allowing ourselves to flow with the process.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Thank you so much, Toby. And thank you so much for your time. I am so pleased we met, and to get to share your work and your book. It really is a pleasure.
Well, me too. And thank you so much for inviting me and for doing this series, because I watched last year's series and really, really enjoyed it and found it so helpful. So it's a real privilege to be part of it this year.
Oh, bless you for saying that. Thank you. And to everybody who's been watching, thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.